Here I am.
Me
Yes.
first thank you for the invitation to share this time with you. It's a great honor for a humble musicant to be asked about his opinion about learning. So what I have to say you my little reflections are the result of 40 years of working as a performer, interpreter, teacher, and so on. So I hope it can be a little contribution about the idea of what learning from our aspect as musicians is. So the title of it is just simple or not so simple: circular and fractal learning versus linear learning. And the idea is music education as a source of inspired and innovative contemporary pedagogy. We live in a world of permanent upheaval. What is valid this morning is already being questioned this evening. A world that is changing at breakneck speed, not least stimulated by artificial intelligence, demands a breathtakingly fast adoption process from all of its residents. As if that weren't enough, the current corona pandemic confronts us with unprecedented challenges from toddlers to seniors. So, how can we manage to deal with this world? By learning. Learning means asking suitable questions about an unknown subject, object, phenomenon, or state of affairs, answering them through observation, collecting information, deduction, experiment, and repetition in order to preserve this answer as available knowledge in the future. Education is created through continuous learning, through the permanent networking of knowledge and insights. The common methods of our learning, however, and this is especially in the context of state schools, and the principle of our pedagogy originate for the most part from times when we traveled on foot, on horseback, or in a carriage, when letters were written by feather, if one was able to write, and carried by messenger. Let's take a little trip back in time. Beethoven's time, 1770. Two children in the countryside. What was these children's world like? What did they have to learn to find their way around this world? What was the future that learning was preparing them for? What was meant by profession? What role did the church and religion play in this? Which skills could be or had to be learned in order to live in and with the world? Everything they needed to know was provided by the everyday experience and knowledge of the older generations. In all likelihood, they would not be required to know French grammar, English poetry, integral equations, or amino acids. Rather, it was the knowledge of which herbs the goats are not allowed to touch, or which stop bleeding knowledge of how butter is made from milk, skills such as sewing and baking bread, which were vital. All of this knowledge is based on tradition, living experience, and circular deduction. It was part of everyday life and had to be learned in order to survive. If things turned out well, they learned to read and write. The church was usually helpful there. On the other hand, a daughter and a son from an aristocratic, wealthy family had a completely different canon of knowledge to learn: riding, fencing, dancing, the art of war for boys, and for girls, poetry, embroidery, playing the piano, etc. The social position determined what they learned and what was considered important. The girl stayed at home, where she learned to be a good wife. The boy was sent to a cadet school, where he was given the necessary polish to make an officer or a loyal civil servant out of him. Only two areas existed in which different kinds of learning were practiced: religion and music. Both areas deal with the unpredictable, the super real, the non-materially, the intangible. To believe means to move beyond knowing, to transcend. The same is true of music. Music works even though we don't know why. What is it about a religious thought that grasps us and our inner being? What moves us to tears in an aria by Bach? How did Jesus learn to formulate his thoughts in ways that aroused and shook people? How could Maria Callas learn to sing an aria in such a way that it stirred the hearts of their listeners? What has changed since then? Our environment and our fellows determine our spirit. We learn what we need to know. Whether farmer, housewife, mathematician, architect, firefighter, engine driver, politician, IT specialist, or emergency doctor, every area of life and activity has its canon of knowledge and skills. The big difference is that our lives and roles are much more complex today and are changing at breakneck speed. As a result of his learning is no longer a finite procedure, but instead a flowing process that is in constant confrontation with reality. The role of music in the history of development must be examined more closely. Music acted as the vehicle for transcendency in every phase of human development. Through music, everyone can perceive their own inner being. Through music, the soul is stimulated. Music penetrates into areas of the subconscious that are otherwise inaccessible. Music was used as an instrument by magicians, priests, and shamans in ancient times. Music was a ritual. Shamans, priests, magicians could be called professional artists. Society delegated the practice of ritual music to them as professionals with specialized tasks. Artists became people's relatives who had learned the craft and the transcendent art and were thus serving to society as psychologists, healers, and comforters. Musical learning involves dealing with the improbable, accepting it and adapting it. However, this requires that one must recognize and acknowledge the existence of the improbable. Musical learning, therefore, includes sensitizing one's own perception in such a way that it does not only accept the obvious, the logical, as a basis for reaction. Musical learning takes place in two stages. In learning physical transactions for the purpose of making an instrument or voice work. In learning those processes that are necessary for the interpretation of music. Fractal and circular learning processes are inherent in musical learning. Learning is, in this sense, means to circle a problem or a task by means of different disciplines to generate a mind map of the result and to work on the outcome in a circular way. Fractal means the big whole is like the small parts. So, in every detail of the piece of music, There is the unique whole, just as our unique person is contained in our DNA. Musical learning makes use of thought models and methods that can be transferred to other areas of learning, i.e., language, history, natural science, social science, economics, psychology, etc. Through studying the material from all sides, we come to results and possible solutions. Through musical training, we enable children and young people to approach networked and global thinking as early as possible and to develop methods that see the world and thus all of its part as a whole, instead of breaking up into fragments. Linear learning, on the other hand, as it is practiced as a method of cognitive information accumulation, cannot adequately reflect the requirements of a world like ours. The perspective always remains monodimensional. Descartes' causality thinking, if then actio reactio, cannot grasp and sufficiently describe our reality. Children and young people who grow up under this educational maxim are not in a position to see through complex problems and to develop solutions. Consequently, even as adults, they will be incapable of adequately solving complex problems. The current situation in the pandemic shows this very clearly. Of the greatest importance, however, is the fact that people learn to deal creatively and unconventionally with complex questions or problems through circular and fractal thinking and learning. As in music, so in the rest of the world, the question determines the answer, not the other way around. Learning is determined by the world in which we live. We therefore need to adopt methods in order to learn for a lifetime what the world is demanding of us. A current example, just like children with online lessons, old people today have to learn to use a tablet, Zoom or Skype, as these are the media that enable them to contact their children and grandchildren when the pandemic has prevented all other ways. In conclusion, it can be seen that contemporary learning can receive the most valuable stimuli from engaging in musical learning, which will enable our children to solve contemporary problems by contemporary means. Making music does not make people more intelligent. It teaches them to think in other, more varied categories and thus to get closer to the reality of life. This is why I appeal to you, see STEAM as a necessary initiative and give music education as much space as possible. Our future lies in the education of the younger generation and their ability to face the challenges of their time with courage and education. They, too, our children, will educate their children for the future. Let's make sure that they have the appropriate tools to hand. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your report, and we look forward to further cooperation, dear Wolfgang. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure that these ideas are not new, but occasionally we have to think about how to integrate these things in our daily life. So I'm very interested in the other contributions, and let's see how all that integrates to each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and the next speaker, Stanislav Demchuk, please.